Aaron.
Yeah.
Why didn't you say it the first time I said Aaron?
Because it's pronounced Aaron.
You done messed up, Aaron.
Aaron is here, everyone. Welcome back for more SPTV, where every day is a great day not to be in a cult. Holy cow. I did not understand the scope of what was happening with Neil Gaiman until I was preparing for this video. People have been asking me about it for, it feels like a couple weeks now, if I'm going to do a video about this. And today is the first time I have had a chance to sit down and read what has been reported and connect some other dots and refamiliarize myself with exactly what Neil Gaiman's history was in Scientology, his family's history in Scientology, how that matches up or doesn't match up with what Neil Gaiman has publicly claimed is his history in Scientology, and learning just how much Scientology Neil Gaiman himself was subjected to at the age of 6 and 7 years old, to an extent that I would not have previously thought possible. You're going to see what I mean as we go forward here. There's basically a 2,900-word article that was written recently in the New Yorker magazine. And I am not going to read this whole thing. The details of the allegations of abuse are so graphic and disturbing, I am not going to read them. I don't think I could bring myself to. The 2,900-word article, and I'll post a link to it. Mods, here, I'll post it in the live chat right now. Actually, I'm just realizing the link that I have is not one that's gonna, let me see if this one shares, guys. If not, anyone feel free to post. Any mods, feel free to post the link to the New York article in the live chat. There's 3 sections of the article that actually get into Scientology stuff. And those are the sections that I'm going to cover with you. Those sections alone are compelling enough for us to discuss this in a video. For the record, Neil Gaiman's father was, at his time, one of the highest executives in Scientology in the world. He was an executive in the Guardian's office. This was a special wing of Scientology management, technically separate from Scientology management, that was responsible for protecting the Scientology movement. It is the Guardian's office. It was run by Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard's wife. It was the Guardian's office that led the operation to infiltrate the United States government, which was called Operation Snow White. 11 or 12 high-level Scientologists went to prison for that, including Mary Sue Hubbard. Neil Gaiman's sister was one of Scientology's highest level executives. I think her name was Claire Edwards. In Scientology, she was the commanding officer of Scientology Missions International. She was a very well-known executive in Scientology. She's one of these executives who sort of disappeared. One of the many executives, David Miscavige, has snapped away from the limelight so that only he would have the limelight. I think his sister was one of the executives that Miscavige imprisoned in the hole up in the Scientology base in Gilman Hot Springs, California. Neil himself was personally the executive director of the Church of Scientology in Birmingham, England. Compare and contrast this to Neil's public statements that Scientology is just something that was like his family did. So he was only like culturally a Scientologist, but not really a Scientologist. Nothing bothers me more than famous celebrity Scientologists pretending they were never really in Scientology. The reason they do this is because publicly departing Scientology is considered a high crime or a suppressive act. Publicly departing Scientology, which means publicly announcing that you have left Scientology, gets you expelled from Scientology, and it makes every Scientologist who you've ever known permanently have to sever all ties with you. Neil Gaiman is being very cute by pretending he was never really a Scientologist, because it's sort of a loophole that, for example, another celebrity, Beck, the musician Beck has pretended he was never really a Scientologist. It was just his parents' thing. And that's what Neil Gaiman is doing. Even though Neil Gaiman was literally the executive director of the Church of Scientology of Birmingham, he was also at least OT4. And I'll tell you, the percentage of Scientologists who ever reached the level of OT4 is probably less, far less than 10%, maybe 5% of all Scientologists ever have done as much Scientology as reaching OT4. Sorry, Neil, you're more than just culturally a Scientologist. To be fair, a Scientologist would probably say that Neil hasn't really been a Scientologist for a very long time. He's never really participated voluntarily for decades. When he was married to, I'm going to get it wrong. Is it Mary? Was he married to a woman named Mary? When he was living in Wisconsin, he was married to a Scientologist named Mary McGrath. While they were married, Mary was a very active Scientologist. She was the head of the OT committee for her local Scientology organization in St. Paul, Minnesota. Mary then went on to be the executive director of the Church of Scientology in St. Paul. They call it the Twin Cities Org. So even while Neil himself was not what they would call an active Scientologist, his money, his marital assets were still going to support Scientology. And I guess that's as much context as I need to provide to that right now. Here's the first section of the article that we're going to look at. Okay, it says, in various interviews over the years, Gaiman has called The Ocean at the End of the Lane his most personal book. While much of it is fantastical, Gaiman said, "That kid is me." The book is set in Sussex, where Gaiman grew up. In the story, the narrator survives otherworldly evil with the help of a family of magical women. As a child, Gaiman had no such friends to call on. Quote, "I was going back to the 7-year-old me and giving myself a particular kind of love that I didn't have," he told an interviewer in 2017. "I never feel the past is dead or young Neil isn't around anymore. He's still there, hiding in a library somewhere, looking for a doorway that will lead him to somewhere safe where everything works." While Gaiman has identified the boy in the book as himself, he has also claimed that none of the things that happened to the boy happened to him. Yet there is reason to believe that some of the most horrifying events of the novel did occur. Gaiman has rarely spoken about a core fact of his childhood. In 1965, when Neil was 5 years old, his parents, David and Sheila, left their jobs as a business executive and a pharmacist and bought a house in East Grinstead, a mile from what was at the time the worldwide headquarters for the Church of Scientology. Its founder, the former science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard, lived down the road from them from 1965 until 1967, when L. Ron Hubbard fled the country and began directing the church from international waters, pursued by the CIA, FBI, and a handful of foreign governments and maritime agencies. David and Sheila were among England's earliest adherents to Scientology. They began studying Dianetics in 1956 and eventually took positions in the Guardian's office, a special department of the organization dedicated to handling Scientology's growing number of legal cases, public communications, and intelligence operations. The mission of this office, as L. Ron Hubbard wrote, was its covert use in destroying the repute of individuals and groups. On the side, the Gaimans ran Scientology's canteen, lodged foreign Scientologists in their home, and opened a vitamin company in town where they supplied courses of supplements for Scientology's detoxification programs, a business that grew exponentially alongside the expansion of Scientology. By the late 60s, David was the church's public face and chief spokesperson in the UK. It was a challenging job, to say the least. The UK, following the example of a handful of other governments, had issued a report declaring Scientology's methods a serious danger to the health of those who submit to them. L. Ron Hubbard would routinely punish members of the organization who committed minor infractions by binding them, blindfolding them, throwing them overboard into icy waters. Back in England, David gave interviews to the press to smooth over such troubling accounts. Scientology was under particular pressure to assure the public it was not harming children. In his bulletins to members, L. Ron Hubbard made it clear that children were not to be exempt from the punishments to which adults were subjected. If a child laughed inappropriately or failed to remember a Scientology term, they could be sent to the ship's hold and made to chip rust for days or confined in a chain locker for weeks at a time without blanket or a bathroom. In his book, Going Clear, hold on. In his book, Going Clear, Lawrence Wright yeah. Yeah, this stuff is rough. All right. In his book, Going Clear, Lawrence Wright recounts the story. All right, we're just going to keep going. I'm going to skip that part. I had never heard this specific story of a child being put in the chain locker, but there are other stories of people who are still alive and still in the former Scientologist community who were locked up in the chain locker as children. And yeah, L. Ron Hubbard telling the child's mother not to object because children are actually just adults in small bodies and are equally responsible for their behavior. Is just a horrifying example of how there are absolutely no guardrails in place whatsoever to protect children from any types of abuse in Scientology. It says David used Neil as an exhibit in his case to the public. In 1968, he arranged for Neil to give an interview to the BBC. When the reporter asked the child if Scientology made him a better boy, Neil replied, "Not exactly that, but when you make a release, you feel absolutely great." Release is Scientology lingo for what happens when you complete one of the lower levels of coursework. That's actually not a good definition, but so actually release, just to be as fair as possible here, is not as fair, but as accurate. In Scientology auditing, they generally say there's two things you're trying to accomplish. You're either trying to erase a mental picture or you're trying to make it move away from you. And at the lower levels, you're trying to make these pictures move away. And that's called a key out or a release. And at one of the higher levels, the goal is to actually make the pictures erase. And so in auditing, the word release will be used also for the feeling of kind of euphoria or I don't know what another word that you would use for it, where it just feels like the weight that you were experiencing, the pressure, the weight, the stress sort of moves away. Relief. It's sort of a feeling of release, of relief and lightness and happiness that can come over you in an auditing session. That's called a release. I think it's kind of interesting that in the context of this article, it sounds like a sexual term. I don't know if you guys take it that way. When I was reading it, I was like, that's an interesting use of the word release in this context, but I assure you it's in this context not a sexual term. Okay, what was happening away from the cameras is difficult to know, in part because Gaiman has avoided talking about it, changing the subject whenever an interview or a friend brings it up. But it seems unlikely that he, Neil, would have been spared the disciplinary measures inflicted on adults and children as a standard practice at that time. According to someone who knew the Gaimans, David and Sheila did apply Scientology's methods at home. When Neil was around the age of the child, in the ocean at the end of the lane, the person said David took him up to a bathtub, ran a cold bath, and drowned him to the point where Neil was screaming for air. I guess I hadn't read that part of the paragraph the first time I read this article. I want to play for you a 3-minute audio clip of a 7-year-old Neil Gaiman giving an interview to a BBC journalist back at whatever year this would have been. You're going to notice that in this interview, a 7-year-old Neil Gaiman says that he has already finished grade 1. That is an auditing level, not a training level. I have never heard of a 7-year-old getting to that level of the bridge. In my 30 years in Scientology, I never got to that level of the bridge. Now, it's a low level of the bridge. Don't get me wrong. Like, someone could walk in the door of a Scientology organization and 6 months later finish grade 1. It is not an introductory level. It is a major level. And after grade 1, I'm sorry, before grade 1 is grade 0. And grade 0, the idea of a 5, 6, or 7-year-old child being put through grade 0 is horrific. Okay. Grade 0 is the communications release. It's all about communication. It's called communications release. There's two components to the main part of grade 0. Things nobody would ever want to talk about, and people nobody would ever want to talk to. And the auditor writes down a custom list of the most horrifically disgusting, offensive, socially unacceptable subjects you could possibly think of. The worse, the better. The more embarrassing, the better. The more degrading, the better. And they assess this list, which means they call out all the items on this list, and they look for a reaction on the e-meter. And then whichever subjects read, the person getting the auditing, in this case, 6 or 7-year-old Neil Gaiman, would basically be forced to talk about these subjects until he claimed to be happy to talk about these subjects without any problem. We're talking about the most disgusting sexual things you could imagine. I've never heard of a child this young getting that advanced auditing. And I'm pointing it out not because I think Neil's lying, but because I think he's telling the truth. It's only 3 minutes long, guys. And let me share the right one. And here it is.
We've got a little bit of, I don't know if it'll be a treat for you, Neil, or not, but we've actually found a recording of you at the age of 7, believe it or not. And you do sound like a very, very intelligent 7-year-old. You were interviewed for a BBC radio program, The World at Weekend, because at the time your father worked for the Church of Scientology.
I remember I'd been thrown out. I'd been thrown out of school.
Well, because
my parents were Scientologists.
Have you heard this since this was broadcast?
I haven't.
This is you at the age of 7.
Go for it.
It is an applied philosophy dealing with the study of knowledge. It helps you to handle quite a lot of problems.
But what problems do you have as a little boy that this helps you with?
Only one big problem.
What's that?
My friend Stephen.
Oh, I see. Is he a Scientologist?
Yes.
He is. But I mean, how does this grade that you've got, problems release, help you to deal with Stephen?
Well, I've dealt every single problem except Stephen. It's one thing problems release can't tell me to handle.
So you still fight with Stephen?
It's more of a question he fights with me.
What kind of memories does that bring back?
Actually, what I was amazed by was the accent. Because there is that, mostly because when I was doing the audio recording of Ocean at the End of the Lane, I was having to go to the BBC website and find recordings of Sussex accents. And listening to that, it was like, oh my gosh, I had one. I never knew.
Who was
Just
Stephen?
a little one, but he was the kid at the end of the lane, or the kid who lived in a house just down the road. And he almost crops up in this book.
Really?
There's a memory of a kid who I think I call somebody Kovacs in this book, who was basically based on him, because I went and stayed the night at his house once. And as soon as his mum closed the door, we were in our bunk beds, he pulls out his water pistol and he started firing it at me. And I'm lying there in bed going, somebody's shooting a water pistol. I don't know how to deal with this. It was, but yeah, it's really funny listening to myself.
You said you were thrown out of school?
My parents were Scientologists and I wasn't allowed in the local school.
You see, he keeps saying my parents were Scientologists, not we were Scientologists or anything like this.
So that was why the BBC came down and interviewed me.
Keith Graves was the man asking the questions,
was.
apparently, so we should give him some credit there. Yeah, you've made it clear that you are not a Scientologist, but that your family members are, including your sister Lizzie, who is thanked at the back of the book. How tricky a situation is that?
It's not tricky. It's family. You know, families are all, they're interesting, they're glorious, they drive you nuts. They're families. I don't know anybody who doesn't have one.
He's so good at answering questions in a way that doesn't really answer questions. I mean, even when he was asked for his thoughts on the recording, instead of giving his thoughts on having been a 7-year-old child Scientologist subjected to high-level, professional level Scientology procedures, he just talks about his accent. I mean, that I was like, whoa, he is trying hard. And he very, very good at making it seem like he's not uncomfortable and not dodging and not avoiding. I was quite impressed. And also you'll notice very specifically accepted the statement, you're not one. Not you used to be one and you're not now, you know. He just makes it seem like it's just anyway, you guys heard it for yourself. Okay. The next part, let me cue up the next part. Well, actually, let's keep going because it gets into Neil actually working for Scientology, not just having family members who work for Scientology. As a teenager, Neil worked for the Church of Scientology for 3 years as an auditor. Yeah, by the way, guys, I mean, if you're going to, you don't just walk in and be an auditor. It takes years, believe it or not, years and years of training to be an auditor. It's not supposed to, but it does. So again, like most Scientologists aren't auditors, okay? Only a few of them actually are. Neil worked for the Church of Scientology for 3 years as an auditor, a minister of Scientology who conducts a process some have likened to hypnosis. One former member of Scientology who worked with Neil's parents and was audited by Neil Gaiman recalls him as precocious and ambitious. It was unusual for a teenager to have completed such a high level of training. But the Gaimans were like royalty. In 1981, David Gaiman was promoted to lead the Guardian's office, making one of the most powerful people in Scientology. But the same year, he fell from grace. A new generation of Scientologists, led by David Miscavige, who eventually succeeded L. Ron Hubbard as Scientology's leader, had L. Ron Hubbard's ear, and David was caught in that grinder, as his former colleague puts it. A document declaring David a suppressive person was released a few years later. It accused him of a range of offenses, including sexual misconduct. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Wow. All right. So, and then it talks about Neil's, the part of Neil's life where he starts becoming a writer. Okay. The next part of this article that I want to read you has to do with Neil's wife trying to get him to open up to her about his childhood in Scientology and him not being able to. Let's see. Okay, right here. Palmer, is it Amanda Palmer? I mean, I read this article. You'd think I could remember his wife's first name, but let's just say it's Amanda Palmer. After they had been together for a few years, Palmer began asking Neil Gaiman to tell her more about his childhood in Scientology. But he seemed unable to string more than a few sentences together. Hold on. I guess it's no wonder he doesn't want people to know he was ever a Scientologist. If his past and his childhood is so, in Scientology specifically, is so painful to him, even though he continued in Scientology much later into his life than just childhood. You know, like it talks about him being a teenage auditor, but I promise you he wouldn't have been a teenager when he was the executive director of the Birmingham org, you know? So it's one of these things where I'm going to guess, you know, from experience, my own and, you know, the shared experiences of many others where at the time, it just doesn't seem that bad. You know, I'm just thinking about how, you know, as a Scientology auditor, like your whole job is sort of, and I know Scientologists would object to characterizing it this way, but your whole job is really to remove emotion from people, you know? The process of auditing is, for the most part, trying to find incidents of pain and unconsciousness or negative emotion, and I'm making a general statement here, but it's somewhat true for both Dianetics auditing and Scientology auditing, is finding moments that are distressing to you and recalling them again and again and again and again, or that's more Dianetic side. On the Scientology side, figuring out what you can take responsibility for in this incident, until you get to a point where you not only no longer feel any negative emotion connected to it, but you actually feel cheerful about it. And even describing it that way sounds so normal in Scientology. But right now it sounds so horrible. Imagine having to be in an auditing session and you're doing auditing on an incident where something horrible happened to you. Not just like a car accident, which would be one example. Well, let's say you were seriously injured in a car accident, but let's say the horrible incident was something very abusive happened to you as a child. And you can imagine how horrible this would be from both the perspective of the person receiving the auditing and both the perspective of the person delivering the auditing, who's been trained to think that this is good and this is okay and this is natural and this is healthy and has had experienced this themselves for dozens or hundreds of hours. Where you're having to go through this incident of something horrible having been done to you as a child until you no longer feel any negative emotion associated with it, and you are actually cheerful. Cheerful to exhilaration would be the sign of the incident having been erased. L. Ron Hubbard said, if you feel any negative emotion whatsoever, fear, anger, grief, it's because there's still something about this incident that was done to you that you have not taken full responsibility for. And that the lack of responsibility is what causes the negative emotion. Imagine being a child who, let's say this incident with Neil, let's say one of his parents literally practically tried to drown him in a bathtub. And you have to get to a point where you've taken responsibility for that incident to the point where you have no anger, resentment, grief, fear, and you actually are cheerful or exhilarated at recalling that incident. That's abuse. And especially when you're trained to believe that the more of this you do, the better you are. The more of this you do, the more spiritually aware you are, the more alive you are, the more uptone you are, the less reactive you are, you know? So it's funny because as I was preparing for this video, of course, it was like, the exposed Neil Gaiman video, and that is still what it is. But it was going through this that I was like, holy shit, I wonder if the author of this article truly understands the significance of the Scientology portions of the article. And it's kind of incredible. So, so she tried to get Neil to tell her about his childhood in Scientology, and he would curl up on the bed into a fetal position and cry and refuse to see a therapist, but instead sat down to write a short story that kept getting longer until it turned into a novel. And the next sentence is the sentence that really got me. He dedicated the book, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, to Amanda, his wife, to Amanda, who wanted to know. And so that's why the author of the article said Neil had always said that the things that happened to the kid in the book didn't happen to me. But the dedication of the book tends to imply that it did. And what's amazing is that in that BBC interview, when they played that clip of him speaking as a 7-year-old, and they asked him, who was that boy that you mentioned that was always fighting with you? Did you guys hear his answer? He said that was the boy at the end of the lane. And he didn't seem to want to talk about it anymore, did he? Yeah. There's one other place where Scientology is mentioned in this article that that struck me. And it's a paragraph that is talking about one of the main victims of, or the one of the women, one of the main accusers of abuse. It was after a particularly disturbing encounter with Neil, and she was taking a shower, and She said she had a migraine, her whole body ached, but she didn't consider leaving. I think she was still in the house. She was still in Neil's house. She had hated herself her whole life, she tells me. And when someone comes along and hates you as much as you hate yourself, it's kind of a relief without it always being consent. She says she understands how Scientologists might have felt when they were sent to the hole, a detention center where they were forced to lick the floor as punishment. She had heard of how some would stay in the room even after they were allowed to leave. People keep licking the floor in that horrible room. The fact that she was comparing her experience of basically being raped to the Scientology executives imprisoned by David Miscavige up at Gilman Hot Springs. That was pretty powerful to me. Neil has written a response on his website. I did my best to verify before doing this video whether anyone has actually filed a lawsuit against Neil at this point, and it doesn't look like there is a lawsuit. I wouldn't be surprised if one is coming, but as of right now, unless anybody in the live stream knows otherwise, please let me know. It doesn't seem like there's actually a lawsuit that has been filed. It also doesn't seem like there's any criminal investigation open right now. Actually, it seems like one was opened and then closed. It also seems like there has been a couple financial settlements that Neil has made with some people in the years past. And I'm also a little confused how I do think that one of the people who he settled with for a few $100,000 and in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement is actually one of the people speaking out. And I have no idea what the legality is of that or what protections the person speaking out has, because it's all a civil matter right now. So I don't understand how all that works either. I'll try to do some follow-ups on that. But I guess the reason why I wanted to say there's no lawsuit and no criminal investigation is because Neil makes it clear in his response. Well, I guess his response would be this, even if there was an open criminal investigation. So let's just take a look at it. Okay. And this is on his website. I looked for it on Twitter or anything, and I can only find it on his website. He says, over the past many months, I've watched the stories circulating the internet about me with horror and dismay. I've stayed quiet until now, both out of respect for the people who were sharing their stories and out of a desire not to draw even more attention to a lot of misinformation. I've always tried to be a private person and felt increasingly that social media was the wrong place to talk about important personal matters. I've now reached the point where I feel I should say something. As I read through the latest collection of accounts, there are moments I half recognize and moments I don't, descriptions of things that happened, sitting beside things that emphatically did not happen. I'm far from a perfect person, but I've never engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with anyone ever. I went back to read the messages I exchanged with the woman around and following the occasions that have subsequently been reported as being abusive. These messages read now as they did when I received them, of two people enjoying entirely consensual sexual relationships and wanting to see one another again. At the time I was in those relationships, they seemed positive and happy on both sides. I guess I want to jump in before I finish reading this to make a comment. I hope you all take time to read the full article. It is very, very disturbing. And what's interesting to me is that technically speaking, what the article says and what Neil says are not even entirely incompatible. The missing element is that, at least in the cases that are discussed in the article, these women were people who worked for Neil or Neil's wife in their home, had no real money of their own, and you could easily put yourself in their shoes and feel the pressure, the pressure, I guess you'd call it the uneven power dynamics in play. And anyway, I guess I just wanted to reiterate, please read the whole article. It is almost impossible not to believe the events as they have been reported. And I guess as I read Neil's statement the first time, I'm going to finish reading it now, but as I read Neil's statement, I couldn't help but think, yeah, but what you're saying doesn't actually contradict what they're saying really. And I'm kind of interested to know what you guys think about it after you read the entire article. Okay, I'll keep going. At the time I was in those relationships, they seemed positive and happy on both sides. And I also realized looking through them years later that I could have and should have done so much better. I was emotionally unavailable while being sexually available, self-focused, and not as thoughtful as I could or should have been. I was obviously careless with people's hearts and feelings, and that's something that I really deeply regret. It was selfish of me. I was caught up in my own story and I ignored other people's. I've spent some months now taking a long, hard look at who I have been and how I have made people feel. Like most of us, I'm learning and I'm trying to do the work needed. And I know that that's not an overnight process. I hope that with the help of good people, I'll continue to grow. I understand that not everyone will believe me or even care what I say, but I'll be doing the work anyway for myself, my family, and the people I love. I'll be doing my very best to deserve their trust as well as the trust of my readers. At the same time, as I reflect on my past, and as I re-review everything that actually happened, as opposed to what is being alleged, sorry, guys, I don't accept there was any abuse. To repeat, I have never engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with anyone. Some of those horrible stories now being told simply never happened, while others have been so distorted from what actually took place that they bear no relationship to reality. I'm prepared to take responsibility for any missteps I made. I'm not willing to turn my back on the truth, and I can't accept being described as someone I am not, and I cannot and will not admit to doing things I didn't do. Interesting. I cannot help but wonder whether a lawsuit is forthcoming. And if there was a lawsuit forthcoming, I'm trying to think whether it would have made sense. Would you want the article to come out? Because this article, it does seem, my understanding is that this article and the women coming forward, that Neil's wife, who he's currently in divorce proceedings with, if what I read was correct, they've been going through a pretty messy divorce for the last 5 years. And the article was written in coordination with his wife, who knew about all these things for years, because she was actually one of the people helping kind of, keep everything managed. So I don't know. I'm sitting here wondering, if a lawsuit was coming, would it have come before this article, or would the article have sort of been the first splash, and then you would expect the lawsuits to come afterwards? I just don't know. But all of this, all these allegations notwithstanding, it seems like Neil still has a show coming out on Netflix soon. He still has a show coming out on Amazon soon. It does seem like some of his projects have been put on hold. One other thing I looked up and I wanted to share with you guys is I just asked Grok the Twitter's AI. I just asked it the question: has Neil Gaiman denied being a Scientologist? The answer was yes. Neil Gaiman has denied being a Scientologist. He has stated that while he was raised in a family with connections to Scientology, he does not practice the religion himself. Gaiman has described his relationship with Scientology as one of cultural background rather than personal belief, and he has publicly distanced himself from Scientology. Particularly since becoming an adult, he has expressed agnostic views and has clarified these points in interviews and public statements over the years. As far as Neil's Scientology involvement, I personally won't be satisfied until he actually acknowledges he was in fact a Scientologist, and perhaps even explains why he decided to no longer be one. See, that's the kind of public conversation that is actually helpful to people. Why did you stop being a Scientologist, even though you'd been one your whole life? Your parents had been one. They were high up. Your sister's high up. You were high up. Being an executive director of a Scientology org and being an auditor and being OT4 is pretty much the definition of being high up in Scientology. Come on, Neil, tell the world. Why did you leave Scientology? What happened to you as a child when you were in Scientology? Why don't you want to talk about your childhood in Scientology? That would be something I would be very interested in hearing. Okay, guys, let's go through a bunch of starred comments and we'll wrap this up. From a poet, Brian Lucas. This makes me sad, and that's on top of everything else. I've read a few of his books, watched a few movies, etc. Weird, but not too weird. Shouldn't be surprised at all. Yeah, I think the first time I was ever introduced to, I've never read any of his books, but I've seen the adaptions of TV shows and movies. I think Stardust was the first one I ever saw. And Stardust, the movie, was pretty freaking sweet. And then, was there a show called American Gods? Was there Neil Gaiman, American Gods? Let me check. Yeah, American Gods, I think, was an Amazon show. Pretty freaking amazing. When I was in Scientology, I'd never even heard of Neil Gaiman. Or that Neil Gaiman was a Scientologist. I think when I was in the Sea Org, is when I first started people like whispering that he was kind of a big deal. And if you just never heard of him, it just never really sinks in. But apparently Neil Gaiman's kind of a big deal. CO Bilf, why would I read Neil Gaiman when I could just reread Mission Earth? Rotten Ralph, I've been observing the Gaiman allegations from the outside, and it is just tragic. Adam Richards, let's not forget Amanda Palmer. She is complicit in all of this too. I feel like no one is talking about that too. Both are awful, no doubt. That's an interesting point. And even in the article, there's really no denying that. And yet the article doesn't really focus on her at all. But I feel like anyone reading the article would be like, seems like there's more to this story. Grox2448, I had no idea he was related to Scientology at all. Does Palmer have any connection? I'm not aware of Amanda Palmer having any connection to Scientology, but if I hear otherwise, I'll let you know. CO Bill, I believe there was some sort of confrontation, tense public meeting between Captain Bill and David Gaiman in East Grinstead in the early 80s. Captain Bill smoked him, if I recall correctly. There's video, I think. Oh my God, I would love to see that. Constance June, I liked Coraline, had no clue a Scientologist wrote it. Main Mystic, I support your work, Aaron. You are the only previous Scientologist I follow. Thank you, Main. Thank you for being here. Susie Q, gee, that may have helped create a predator. It's true. But, you know, I have in the past made a statement that I guess felt true, but I don't have any research to indicate it was true. And some people took issue with it, which is that people who were abused in certain ways as children many times grow up to commit the same abuse. And that's something that feels true, but upon reflection is actually kind of horrifically offensive to people who were abused as children. I mean, telling a child who was abused, especially sexually, that they're like, you know, destined to grow up to become a predator is horrifically offensive. And I don't actually have the stats to back up such a statement. I guess I would be comfortable saying this. Having a childhood such as that would very obviously and understandably create a very deeply, deeply damaged and troubled individual who may go on to do a variety of things. I think that's a fair statement. Edward says, Scientology instruction is clearly intended to induce late affect sociopathy. Good Juju Travels, he's distancing himself because he knows how crazy it is. Ray Bay, if Scientology teaches one anything, it's how to avoid natural emotions in an unnatural way. I like that. Katie Cat Dickinson, I'm new here, saw Neil Gaiman's name, and I had no idea he was a Scientologist. Sounds of Arcturus, he never chose to be a Scientologist. I can understand him detaching here. But that's true. But you know, that's true of any second or third or fourth gen Scientologist. And not having chosen to be one doesn't make you not one. Now, there's plenty of kids who've grown up in Scientology families, only ever reluctantly did a course here or a course there, never really embraced it, And as soon as they were on their own, never had anything to do with it. I have friends like that. And they rightfully and justifiably say, I was never really a Scientologist. You can't say that if you're OT4. You can't say that if you were the executive director of an org when you were an adult. So I think it is different. Cherie Lebrun, writing all that down had to be therapeutic for him. Childhood trauma can come up anytime in life. Adam Richards, this was quite the topic of conversation today when I hit the comic book shop for New Comic Day. Wow. Yeah, I think I underestimate how famous Neil Gaiman is. To me, he's just a fringe character who happens to have been a Scientologist. Like, I think I really underestimate how famous he is. Main Mystic, welcome as a new channel member. Acute Pumpkin Clodhopper. The brainwashing does more damage if you're a small child when it starts. Love Maddie. The trauma for him as a child in Scientology must have been really bad. This is one of the many reasons why the Scientology needs to be gone. They brainwash parents, which causes them to abuse their own children. Love Maddie says his dad was high up in the Guardian's office in England. Both of his parents were heavy duty in it. Can you imagine what pressures that were on him to be the perfect Scientologist child? I mean, the evidence of that is his father trotting him out as a 7-year-old to do an interview with the BBC. As I was reading, it was actually a little hard to understand what he was saying in that interview. I had read a transcript of it earlier in the day. I didn't quite realize how hard it was to understand what he was saying. The transcript was very clear. As I was reading the transcript, as soon as I saw the word release, I put myself in the journalist's shoes. And I imagine the journalist was like, I think this child is talking about being sexually abused. I am almost positive that is what the journalist thought 7-year-old Neil Gaiman was saying. All right, guys, a little bit of a heavy one. That might be it for tonight. Thank you all for hanging out with me. Thank you to everyone who watches until the very end. And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not,